May 22, 1943, near Frosinone, Italy. Obergefreiter Karl Weiss gripped the side of his Opel truck as the convoy crawled along a narrow country road. The morning mist clung to the hills, muffling the rumble of engines. To him, it felt like any other supply run cautious, slow, and exposed. Then came the sound, not the distant whistle of artillery, nor the heavy drone of high-altitude bombers. This was lower, sharper, growing like a predator circling overhead. The men craned their necks skyward, expecting the familiar shapes of Messerschmitts, or perhaps a lone Allied fighter. Instead, out of the haze, a twin-engine silhouette descended fast, deliberate, hunting. Its nose did not curve sleekly like a bomber. It bristled, gleaming in the sun, as if an arsenal had been fused to the front of the machine. Before anyone shouted a warning, the air erupted. 8 synchronized. 50 caliber guns opened at once, spitting a torrent of flame. The sound was not gunfire as Karl had known it. It was a solid wall of noise, a crushing roar that swallowed every other sound. The road ahead disintegrated, trees exploded into splinters, metal tore apart as if made of paper. The convoy scattered in chaos, men diving for ditches, praying the storm would pass. For the first time, Karl realized this was not a bomber, merely dropping death from above. This was something new, a machine built to tear its prey apart head-on, and it meant the skies had changed forever. The attack near Frosinone was no accident. It was the result of an evolution in warfare that had been building for months. By the spring of 1943, the Allies faced a critical problem. German convoys and supply lines snaked across occupied Europe, feeding divisions in Italy, Tunisia, and beyond. Traditional bombers, flying high, could damage rail yards or bridges, but they struggled to strike moving targets with precision. What the Allies needed was something faster, lower, and far deadlier. The solution came from a medium bomber that had already carved its name into history, the B-25 Mitchell. Famous for leading the Doolittle raid over Tokyo in 1942, the Mitchell was versatile, rugged, and produced in staggering numbers. Yet, in the hands of imaginative engineers and daring field officers, it would be transformed into something altogether new. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a maverick in the Pacific Theater, had experimented with ripping out the glazed bomber noses and replacing them with forward-firing, 50 caliber guns. His logic was simple. Instead of dropping bombs from above, why not turn the entire aircraft into a flying gun platform, capable of tearing through enemy shipping, trains, and convoys? The idea spread quickly, and soon, modified B-25 seconds began appearing in both the Mediterranean and European skies. For German troops on the ground, the first encounters were bewildering. Diaries from infantrymen reveal their confusion. "We thought it was a bomber, but it came directly for us, firing like a storm." Unlike dive bombers, which delivered quick strikes and pulled away, the Mitchell gunships pressed their attacks head-on, their 8 nose guns unleashing up to 100 rounds every second. Trucks, tanks, even fortified positions were shredded in moments. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers who once felt relative safety beneath high-level bombing now discovered that no road, no valley, no convoy was beyond reach. Luftwaffe pilots, too, began to take notice. They realized these were not ordinary bombers, and intercepting them would prove far more dangerous than expected, because the B-25 did not just carry forward guns. Soon, entire formations appeared with additional side-mounted weapons, turning every pass into a hurricane of lead, and this was only the beginning. Within months, the Allies would unleash swarms of Mitchell gunships across occupied Europe, not only cutting German supply lines to ribbons, but proving that the very balance of the air war had shifted. The day was coming when German soldiers would look skyward, not in defiance, but in dread, as the roar of engines meant not bombs from above, but a storm of fire racing straight toward them. The first encounters with the gun-nosed B-25 seconds seemed almost unbelievable to German troops. At first, They dismissed the strange aircraft as an odd variant of the bomber they had seen many times before. But the truth became clear in seconds. These machines were not flying over them to bomb distant cities. They were diving directly at convoys, tearing through trucks, horses, and tanks with a fury unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced. In letters home, soldiers described the shock. One corporal wrote, "We thought it was dropping bombs." But then came fire, endless fire, as if the sky itself had split open. For men used to the measured rhythm of artillery or the single passes of Stuka dive bombers, the constant, hammering roar of 8.50 caliber guns felt like the end of the world. The statistics were brutal. Each B-25 could fire up to 100 rounds every second. A single strafing pass could shred an entire convoy. Even armoured vehicles that once seemed invulnerable to small arms fire found themselves torn apart by concentrated bursts aimed into engines, tyres, and fuel tanks. But it was not just the destruction that unsettled German forces. It was the precision. Unlike bombers that relied on altitude and luck, the Mitchell gunships hunted like predators, swooping low, banking hard, and returning again and again until nothing moved below. They struck rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and even isolated infantry positions, leaving behind not just wreckage, but terror. Luftwaffe reports reveal their unease. Pilots tasked with intercepting the B-25's quickly discovered that closing in was no simple matter. A fighter approaching head-on risked flying into the hurricane of fire from the nose guns. Attacking from the sides or rear meant braving blistering defensive fire from waist and tail gunners. What had once been an easy target, a lumbering medium bomber, was now a fortress bristling with steel. The psychological shift spread quickly. German commanders began warning convoys to travel only at night, but even then, the fear lingered. The memory of the roar, the flash, the relentless tearing of metal haunted every road and every march. And the Allies were only getting started. Each week, more modified Mitchells rolled off assembly lines, each one deadlier than the last. Soon, entire squadrons flew in formation, their nose guns blazing in synchronized fury, turning valleys into killing grounds. For German troops, the sight of those twin engines cutting through the mist carried a single message. Nowhere was safe anymore. Because if one gunship could obliterate a convoy, imagine what dozens could do when unleashed together. The transformation of the B-25 from bomber to gunship did more than shock enemy convoys. It rewrote the very rhythm of the battlefield. Each new mission revealed layers of power the Germans had never anticipated, each encounter peeling back another truth about the scale of Allied innovation. The first shock was logistical. In the past, German units relied on the relative safety of roads hidden under tree cover or winding through valleys. But now, B-25's skimmed treetops, their pilots weaving through obstacles with deadly precision. Convoys that once slipped past unnoticed were ambushed in daylight, cut down before they reached the front. "We could not move even 1 kilometre without fear," wrote a German driver. The planes were always there, circling like hawks. Then came the material shock. These aircraft were not fragile, single-pass raiders. They were armoured, resilient, and bristling with firepower. Even after taking hits from flak and rifles, Mitchells pressed their attacks, strafing again and again until their targets burned. Witnesses described fuel trucks erupting in towering fireballs, ammunition wagons detonating with thunder that echoed across valleys. The third revelation was industrial. To German eyes, the very number of B-25's seemed impossible. They appeared not in isolation, but in formations, squadrons sweeping across entire regions. Each week, there were more. Factories in America were producing nearly 300 Mitchells every month, flooding the skies with machines that no amount of German production could match. And then came the cultural shock. German soldiers had been taught to believe in their superiority, that Allied machines were crude, clumsy, or temporary solutions. But standing amid the wreckage of shattered convoys, they saw a different truth. The Allies were not only matching them, they were surpassing them, innovating faster, adapting quicker, and striking harder than the Reich could answer. By the autumn of 1943, the Mitchell gunships were doing more than cutting supply lines. They were breaking morale. German infantrymen began to write home about the constant fear of the low-flying bombers with endless guns. Luftwaffe pilots, once hunters, now found themselves hunted, forced to choose between attacking head-on and being shredded, or staying away and watching helplessly as convoys burned below. The shift was unmistakable. The B-25 had become more than a bomber. It was now a symbol proof that Allied air power had evolved into a machine of relentless precision and overwhelming force. And the greatest revelation still lay ahead, because if these gunships could already paralyze German supply lines in Italy and France, what would happen when the full weight of Allied industry unleashed them across every front? The answer was coming, and when it did, it would shake the very foundations of the Luftwaffe's belief in victory. By late 1943, the B-25 Mitchell was no longer just a weapon of surprise. It had become a demonstration of industrial might, a signal to the Germans that Allied power was not only growing, but accelerating beyond imagination. Factories in Kansas, Michigan, and California worked around the clock. On average, nearly 300 Mitchells rolled out every single month. Each one carried more firepower than many entire Luftwaffe squadrons. To the German soldiers on the ground, it felt as if every valley, every bridge, and every convoy route was haunted by these gunships. The scale was staggering. Over 10,000 B-25s would be built by war's end, and thousands of them modified into dedicated strafers, their noses bristling with 8, 10, sometimes even 14 forward-firing guns. Engineers experimented relentlessly, adding side packs, underwing pods, and extra turrets until the Mitchell looked less like a bomber and more like a flying fortress of fire. But the numbers alone did not tell the story. The true weight of this transformation was felt by those on the ground. A German lieutenant in Italy wrote bitterly in his journal, "We cannot move by day. The Americans know where we are. Their planes arrive in groups, always lower, always louder, and when they pass, there is nothing left." His words reflected not only destruction but despair, the realization that Germany's carefully planned logistics system was collapsing before his eyes. For the Allies, the effect was equally transformative. Pilots reported the sense of empowerment, of flying a machine that could dominate the battlefield with sheer firepower. One American airman recalled, "It wasn't just dropping bombs anymore. We were cutting through the enemy with our own hands. You could see the damage with every pass." The B-25 gunship was not only a weapon, it was a psychological tool, giving Allied crews the confidence that they could dictate the fight. And the missions grew bolder. No longer confined to convoys or isolated depots, Mitchells began hammering coastal defences, airfields, and even shipping harbours. Entire ports were paralysed as strafing runs shredded flak guns and fuel storage tanks. German attempts to repair or resupply were destroyed within hours, as the gunships returned again and again, relentless as the tide. This industrial power, fused with tactical innovation, marked a turning point. Germany, once confident in its Luftwaffe's superiority, now faced a machine of war it could neither match in production nor counter in strategy. The B-25 had become a symbol of inevitability, proof that Allied skies were no longer contested but commanded. And yet, the most devastating shock had not arrived, because beyond the roar of the Mitchells, beyond the thunder of their guns, another truth was waiting to emerge, a truth not measured in numbers or firepower, but in morality. When German soldiers finally confronted that revelation, it would not just break supply lines, it would shatter belief itself. The B-25 Mitchell had already transformed the battlefield with firepower, but its presence also carried something deeper, a cultural and emotional shift that neither side had anticipated. War was not only fought with bullets and bombs, it was waged in the minds and spirits of those who lived beneath the wings of these machines. For German soldiers, the psychological strain grew heavier with every mission. The roar of twin engines overhead no longer meant a chance of survival. It meant exposure, helplessness, and the creeping realization that the skies no longer belonged to them. A diary entry from a Wehrmacht sergeant captured the mood. "We crouch in ditches, we cover our ears, but the sound follows us everywhere. It is not just metal that breaks under their fire, it is our will." Yet, on the other side, Allied crews felt a surge of confidence unlike anything before. They were no longer anonymous bombers dropping explosives from distant heights. They could see the enemy's reaction, could witness the impact of each pass. Some pilots described it as intoxicating, the feeling of taking control of the battlefield. But others admitted it came with a weight, the haunting memory of convoys scattered, of men running, of villages left in smoke. This contrast revealed a cultural divide. German propaganda had long insisted that Allied machines were crude, their pilots undisciplined. But the reality contradicted the myth. Mitchell crews demonstrated precision, discipline, and a determination that defied expectation. To many Germans, it was disorienting. The enemy was no longer the caricature they had been taught to despise. He was skilled, resourceful, and overwhelming. Moments of humanity emerged even amid destruction. After strafing runs, Allied crews sometimes circled villages, watching civilians scatter, torn between their mission and the lives caught beneath. Letters from pilots reveal an unease. "We were told to destroy the trucks, but I still see the farmers running across the fields, their carts overturned. War makes no difference between soldier and bystander." These words carried the beginning of a moral shift, a recognition that power alone could not define victory. And for captured German soldiers, the shock was doubled. Many expected brutal treatment at the hands of the Allies, convinced by years of Nazi propaganda. Instead, they often found themselves given food, water, even medical care. One prisoner later recalled, "I thought they would kill us after what we had seen in the convoy. Instead, they gave me bread. At that moment, I knew everything we had been told was a lie." The B-25's firepower had broken convoys and crippled supply lines. But its deeper impact was this. It forced soldiers to confront the collapse of the illusions they had carried into battle. And just as German troops began to grasp this emotional weight, a new revelation loomed, one that would dwarf even the terror of the gunship's roar. Because soon, they would discover not just the scale of Allied firepower, but the moral abyss into which their own leaders had led them. By the winter of 1943, the B-25 Mitchell had become a storm across the skies. What began as a field modification had grown into an industrial onslaught, and now the full scale of its power could be measured not in isolated strikes, but in waves of destruction that spanned entire regions. The scale was staggering. In Italy alone, Allied squadrons launched hundreds of sorties every week. Convoys that once carried food, fuel, and ammunition to the front were obliterated in minutes. Rail networks painstakingly repaired by German engineers were shredded again within days. Bridges rebuilt with desperate labor collapsed under strafing fire before they could even be used. The Luftwaffe, once the master of European skies, now struggled simply to respond. The statistics told their own story. A single gunship, with 8 to 14 forward-firing guns, could unleash over 1,000 rounds in a single pass. In coordinated formations, entire valleys disappeared under a curtain of lead. German reports speak of entire battalions immobilized, of units forced to abandon vehicles and march on foot. For soldiers who once relied on speed and mobility, the loss of transport was more than inconvenience, it was paralysis. This was the scale climax, numbers, firepower, and relentless efficiency stacking higher than anything the Reich could match. But beyond the sheer might of Allied industry, a second revelation waited, one that would pierce deeper than statistics, striking at the very heart of German belief. Because as B-25 seconds darkened the skies, German soldiers also began to uncover the truths their leaders had hidden from them. In occupied villages, in abandoned camps, in whispers carried by prisoners, the reality of what the Reich was doing became impossible to ignore. The propaganda that had once painted Germany as a righteous defender collapsed in the face of undeniable evidence. Captured diaries reveal the moral shock. One Wehrmacht officer, taken after a convoy ambush, confessed to his interrogators, "We thought we were fighting for honor, but everywhere we retreat, we see only ruins of our own making." For him, the sight of Allied power was not just defeat in the air, it was the mirror held up to his nation's crimes on the ground. The contrast was devastating. Allied pilots, despite unleashing storms of fire, often treated prisoners with humanity. Food was shared, wounds were tended. The very men who had faced their merciless guns in battle were now offering compassion. To German soldiers who had been raised on fear and lies, this was a revelation more shattering than any bombardment, and so the B-25 gunship came to symbolize not only industrial superiority, but moral reversal. Each strafing run was a reminder of Allied strength. Each act of unexpected kindness was proof of German weakness. Together, they eroded the last pillars of faith in the Reich. The skies no longer carried hope for German soldiers. They carried the roar of inevitability, the thunder of guns above, and the silent weight of truth below. But this was not the end, because the legacy of the Mitchell, and the collapse it helped accelerate, would echo far beyond the battlefields. The question remained, after so much fire and revelation, what would remain when the war finally ended? The roar that had once shaken Karl Weiss and his convoy outside Frosinone was no longer an isolated terror by the spring of 1944. It had become a pattern, a rhythm, a symbol of inevitability. For German troops, the sound of twin engines and the hammering of nose-mounted guns came to define their retreat across Italy, France, and eventually into the heart of Germany itself. The B-25 Mitchell had done more than cripple supply lines. It had accelerated the collapse of a military machine that once seemed unstoppable. Every shattered convoy, every burned-out rail yard, every crippled harbour chipped away at the Reich's illusion of control. And with each mission, German soldiers felt less like warriors and more like prey. Yet the true legacy of the gunship was not measured only in destroyed vehicles or disrupted roads. It was measured in transformation in how men on both sides left the war, seeing the world differently than when they had entered it. For American crews, the B-25 was proof of what ingenuity could achieve. They had taken a medium bomber and, through daring modification and relentless industry, turned it into a weapon that redefined air power. Many of those pilots would later become instructors, engineers, and leaders, carrying forward lessons about innovation and adaptability into the post-war world. To them, the Mitchell was more than a machine. It was a teacher. For German soldiers, the gunship represented the shattering of myths. The Reich had promised invincibility, had declared the Luftwaffe untouchable, had painted its enemies as weak and disorganized. Yet here was undeniable proof of the opposite. Enemy skies filled with precision, power, and coordination. A captured German officer would later admit, "When we saw the gunships, we knew. The war was lost long before Berlin." Civilians, too, felt the weight of this transformation. Villagers across Italy and France watched convoys burn on their doorsteps, but they also saw Allied airmen show restraint, sparing towns when possible, even dropping food in desperate hours. These contradictions carried a moral weight that lingered long after the smoke cleared. The very machines that brought terror also carried hope, signaling that liberation was drawing nearer. By war's end, more than 10,000 B-25 Mitchells had been produced. They flew in every theatre from the jungles of Burma to the mountains of Italy, from the islands of the Pacific to the heart of Europe. They had strafed, bombed, scouted, and trained generations of airmen. Few aircraft embodied the adaptability of the Allied war effort so completely, and yet, their most enduring legacy was not simply in statistics or missions flown, it was in perspective. The Mitchell forced both friend and foe to confront the changing nature of warfare, that technology, innovation, and sheer will could overturn even the strongest belief in dominance. It reminded soldiers like Karl Weiss that no empire, no matter how confident, could withstand the tide of relentless adaptation. When Karl looked back years later, he no longer remembered only the roar of engines or the wall of fire. He remembered the silence afterward, the moment he realized that the future would not belong to the Reich. It would belong to those who could innovate, endure, and rebuild. And so the story that began on a misty road in Italy closed not with the echo of destruction, but with the weight of understanding. The day German troops first faced the B-25's 8-gun nose, the tide of war did not merely shift. It turned, irrevocably, toward a world that would never be the same again.